Water's importance to human society and life in general is only matched by its versatility. We need to drink about 3 liters of water a day in order to survive. Water covers a majority of the Earth's surface. It powers our homes. Sometimes it even rains from the sky. Needless to say, something as consequential and important to life as water has worked its way into many cultures around the world, and as a consequence, into many of our artistic and media representations. Water is so permanently ingrained in our collective psyche that it's not really a surprise that it has its own implications in cultures around the world. Knowing all that, it's not a surprise that a substance so important to human culture and life has made its way into various pieces of art and media that we consume and create. And while water in any form of media can be interesting, my particular fascination is with water in video games. An incredible amount of video games feature water in some way or another. Sometimes it's a barrier, sometimes it's a tool, sometimes it's a resource to be managed, sometimes it's nothing more than pretty set dressing. In all of these scenarios, though, water has the power to shape the scenario that it's a part of. I want to focus on the ways in which water interacts with, enhances, or even acts as the anchor for specific moods and themes in games, as well as how water and the environments that contain them can make the player feel. It makes sense to me then to start with real-life water as a reference point. Take, for example, the waterfall over here. Think about how its very presence in this scene can affect how you feel about it. How often the sound of flowing water is associated with calm feelings and peace. Think about the sound of flowing water rushing between your fingers or over your face, how often that's associated with reinvigoration or cooling, and how those things can affect a scene as well. I'd be willing to bet that even just talking about those things right now made you feel those sensations, didn't they? Video game water, though, isn't real. It's an illusion. It's electrical signals dancing across a screen and in plastic boxes directed when we push buttons. While technicality and realistic simulation can be extremely impressive and can add to the mood of a scene, very seldom is the realism with which that water presented the sole factor or even a major factor in the determinant of that mood. Simple suggestions of water, such as a light blue shape or a reflective pool, can invoke those same feelings that the video of water did just a moment ago. So, how do video games portray water? Early 3D titles, such as Sonic Adventure and Ape Escape, use repeating animated textures overlaid on flat surfaces with blue tints and transparency to imply bodies of water. And yet, despite the obvious technical limitations of the hardware of the times, both of these titles do a serviceable job at creating the beach settings of Emerald Coast and Krabby Beach, respectively. Areas where you can sit and admire the coastline, feel like you can smell the sea breeze, or imagine the sound of water lapping at your feet. Except, you can actually hear those things. Soundscapes are just as important, if not more so, than the visuals of water when it comes to maintaining the illusion. Those beaches I showed earlier would feel far different without the music or sound effects to help convey the idea across. That's where I feel Spyro 2 and 3 do a much better job at conveying the feeling of water, with small sound effects and a very low-pass filter added to the music to help really sell the idea that you're moving through water. How games affect your controls can also be an effective way to portray water. Dark Souls, in addition to audio and visual cues, also hampers your movement while moving through deeper water, something I find adds a lot to areas like Blighttown, which is a ramshackle town that's supposed to be built on top of a large leech-infested swamp. Alternatively, when you're completely submerged, games will often resort to alternative control schemes or have different character physics entirely. BioShock II, Ultra Kill, and plenty of other games slow your movement significantly while underwater while also decreasing gravity, allowing you to jump higher but fall slower, feeling more sluggish in the water. Others, like Devil May Cry and Monster Hunter, have sections where moving through the water actually changes how you control your character significantly. The different control schemes and ways simulated physics cause each character to react in water lead to a more deliberate, almost ponderous approach to movement. Each of these methods help sell the idea that your character is actually in the water. They're surrounded by it. They're in an unfamiliar environment. Of course, natural water features aren't the only way that water can show up in a game. Exploring areas with artificial water, like pools or canals, can be just as interesting, especially areas like Delfino Plaza or Rico Harbor in Super Mario Sunshine. Most of Sunshine is dominated by water, not just aesthetically, but mechanically due to flood. And you can tell that a lot of effort went into making the game's water look much better than competitors from around the same time period. The fluid simulations look phenomenal for the time period and definitely help establish the mood and setting a lot, but just as important are the little details. The little boats floating around Delfino Plaza, or the massive scaffolding and oil spills around Rico Harbor. They help define these places as bustling towns and ports, despite the tranquil appearance of the water itself. I could spend the whole video talking about Sunshine and its stylistic choices, but there are plenty of other games to talk about as well, even from this time period. Nintendo seemed to iterate a lot on their work with Super Mario Sunshine's water with Pikmin 2's water, which is a bit ironic considering that Super Mario Sunshine's water is likely itself an iteration of Pikmin 1's water. Being a top-down game, Pikmin 2's water looks a bit more plasticine than Super Mario Sunshine's water, which is likely just due to the oblique angle at which you're viewing it. Pikmin's environments, however, are based off a much smaller scale. Instead of looking at oceans and seas, you're simply looking at a puddle on the forest floor. Most of Pikmin's environments are no greater than a few feet across. Super Mario Sunshine's environments lead itself to feeling more like a wide-open exploration game as opposed to Pikmin 2, which feels much more intimate and closely focused. It's interesting to see how two games using very similar technology and appearances for their water can end up with completely different feels in the final product. For some context, The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind was released in the same year that Super Mario Sunshine was. It uses a water implementation that was pretty common for the time, a flat water plane with a moving texture on it, a low-pass filter over all the game audio while you're underwater, and a slight blue filter to the camera. Admittedly, it doesn't look very good, even by 2002 PC gaming standards. However, it's a nice baseline nonetheless. So if it's not technically impressive or pretty, what does Morrowind's water bring to the table? Well, for one, Morrowind has a lot of water-based environments to explore. Flooded caves and sunken ships are common along the coast, and if you go exploring deeper into the depths, you can find things like sunken temples beyond the fog that's mostly used for performance reasons, but still manages to help provide an air of mystery. Vivec, as well as several other cities, have massive sewer systems that are filled with rats and junk to collect, as well as many treasures occasionally. The dark nature of underwater traversal, as well as the numerous underwater enemies and the need to figure out how to breathe underwater in such a hostile environment, lends itself an air of suspense and mystery and discovery, something which is supplemented by Morrowind's music. Sometimes. Morrowind's music, it doesn't always work right. Not all the music really fits properly. Morrowind also does an excellent job of rewarding player exploration, something which is seen with the sunken shrine of Boethia off the coast, which rewards you with one of the best swords in the game. In other words, water in Morrowind helps Morrowind do the thing that it does best, which is provide an interesting and hostile environment to explore that feels rewarding to overcome. Speaking of hostile environments, there's plenty of games that use water as an aspect of those. BioShock II is a bit of an oddball in that case. The game explicitly tells you that the water cannot hurt you, but the overall environment of being at the bottom of the ocean can still feel quite stifling. Slowed movement, muffled sounds, little particles floating in the water, and the inclusion of wildlife such as jellyfish, bioluminescent coral, and sharks. These little details show off excellent level design, shunting you somewhere where you don't really belong. There's a sort of relief to be found when the airlock finally drains, like a breath is being let out of you. Soma achieves a very similar effect, albeit with more impressive graphics and a much moodier atmosphere. The outside of an abandoned underwater research facility makes for a perfect setting to show off how hostile, alien, and oppressive the atmosphere of being underwater can feel. Subnautica is another game that evokes that oppressive and hostile atmosphere, with some people saying that it even evokes thalassophobia, which is a fear of the ocean, specifically deep water. And honestly, I can't blame them. The game does an excellent job at evoking that idea of the unknown, of something so vast and unknowable that anything could come out at any moment and touch you. It reminds me a lot of being young and getting into an area of a video game that you're not supposed to be in. It's almost a liminal space sort of feeling. You feel like you're not supposed to be there, that you don't belong, but you're also afraid of what might come out after you. Despite the name, Ultrakill can actually encapsulate a very relaxing feeling with some of its levels. In the middle of a set of stages centered around the flooding of the river Styx into an ocean of souls with the murder of every single human on Earth, you find a quiet little island where there's no combat, no blood, none of the intensity that you'll find elsewhere. Instead, you find a comforting little guitar melody and some fish. Fishing games are, admittedly, something I initially skimmed over when I was writing this script. Everybody loves a good fishing mini-game, but entire games based around fishing were more or less played out in the early 2000s. That being said, it's obvious that a fishing video game couldn't exist without some sort of water. Trying to simulate the real-world pastime has taken a number of forms over the years. Some games take the approach of trying to recreate the mood of fishing. Relaxed, serene, simply waiting for a bite to happen. Real Fishing Wild is an example of one of these games. FMV video of real-life places shown with real-time rendered sprites and polygons on top. Serene, peaceful vistas, only interrupted by the casting of a lure, the bite of a fish, and the struggle that ensues. A nice place to contemplate the pixelated videos of rivers and just relax, pretending you're there while staying in the comfort of your own home. Then there's the other kind of fishing game. Sega bass fishing definitely falls on the more arcadey side of fishing games, probably because it was actually an arcade game. Heavy, abrasive MIDI music, even when you're still looking for a bite. Screaming guitar sound effects and bright, loud imagery. There's a secret castle level where the music sounds like it's more out of a horror game than anything remotely close to a fishing game. Really bizarre vibes, admittedly, for a game that's about something that generally is considered calming. It's the exact opposite of something like Real Fishing, with a reliance on the flashy lights and sounds pumping out of the machine to draw in new players with their coins. The water almost feels like an afterthought here, an excuse to have the player try to catch the biggest pile of numbers possible. But I suppose that's also part of the appeal of arcade games anyway. You can leave an impact on the world others can see on the leaderboards. You can prove that your fish story wasn't made up and you did, in fact, catch a fish that was this big. Though at the end of the day, does water have to be such a focus of the game? Taking a step back from our study, how much emphasis do games themselves put on the water? For some games, it's simply an afterthought, a piece of the environment that's meant to illustrate a point, or a piece of tech. Shadow of the Colossus, particularly the PS4 remake, has some remarkable water features. Massive lakes and waterfalls dwarf your figure and hide the creatures you're trying to fight, making your adventures in the Colossi themselves seem even more grandiose by comparison. Sea of Thieves as well uses its advanced water tech to simulate a whole ocean for you to traverse. Itself, both an area to explore and an antagonist to overcome as you patch damage to your boat and struggle to maneuver your lumbering vessel. Both of these games use the scale of their water features to make the world seem vast and grand and you seem small by comparison. Many adventure games do the same thing, to show water as an unstoppable force, an impossible thing for you to deal with as a single person, but still something to be appreciated and something to find beauty in. For a game that has a decent number of quests that involve swimming through ancient caves or sunken ships, there's not really much you can do in Skyrim's water. You can't even perform combat normally against annoying slaughterfish as they try to hurt you. In this sense, the water acts as more of a barrier to what you want than as a medium, a boundary for the world, so to speak. Skyrim uses its water to provide a sense of scale for an area, something grand and interesting to look at, like a waterfall. Maybe it'll have some treasure behind it. Admittedly, I'm not quite sure where the trend of looking behind waterfalls started. The furthest back I can trace the trend of putting interesting rewards behind waterfalls is The Legend of Zelda on the NES, but there's nothing saying it can't go back further, even into the days of early tabletop RPGs. Whatever the origin, the idea that a curtain of water can be peeled back and a player's curiosity can be rewarded is pervasive and shows up in games from nearly every console generation. And in a lot of ways, rewarding players for exploration and curiosity lends itself well to most game designs. Still, I think that putting things behind waterfalls is a bit cliche nowadays, to the point that people complain when there isn't something behind a waterfall, but also lament when there is something behind a waterfall. And that's not to mention that putting items behind a waterfall, let alone having space to put items behind a waterfall, is rather rare in the real world. The soft rock behind a waterfall can be worn down by erosion, but more often than not, those pockets will collapse very quickly with that same erosion, due to how soft they are. Lo and behold, there's this giant underhang. It's not at the waterfall, but it's right there. But I'm getting a bit off track here. We were talking about water, right? Subnautica is one of the latest of a series of games that really explores what it's like to live in the water. Abzu gained a reputation for being a gorgeous celebration of the ocean and life itself, and is generally praised for its presentation, including its gorgeous environments based off of the ocean's myriad of biomes. It's not exactly a long game, but it presents itself in such a way that you feel like you can spend ages simply existing in it. Endless Ocean feels like an ancestor to these games. Ariga, composed of former Capcom employees, has a massive catalog of games spanning Street Fighter's short-lived EX spin-off series, Tetris 99, Chocobo GP, and Tekken 7 and 8. However, back in the 2000s, Arica made a series of games that focused on scuba diving of all things, and exploration of the ocean and its massive environments, its inhabitants, and all the little things that have been left behind by humans as they've dropped them in the water. The sound of oxygen slowly, methodically being pulled out of a tank and into your lungs, the deliberate and slightly chunky controls, and the ever-present sound of water in your ears are constant reminders that you're not in a place fit for humans to live. And yet it's not hard to enjoy the view, to appreciate the feeling of discovery and the beauty of the biomes that you're in. This game apparently did well enough to warrant a sequel, and itself is a spiritual successor to another series of games made by Arica for the PS2 called Everblue, which featured similar gameplay. Of course, I can't bring up underwater games without talking about Echo the Dolphin, a game where a group of intelligent dolphins defends the world and its oceans from an alien threat in the present by hopping around in time. Known for its difficulty, somewhat nonsensical logic, gorgeous graphics and music, and awkward control scheme. And no, I'm not talking about the Genesis game. Echo the Dolphin Defender of the Future is a game that fascinates me, even though I've only ever played the first few levels. According to the Wikipedia article for the game, which appears to reference an interview that doesn't exist, trust me, I spent an hour looking for the interview, Appaloosa Entertainment's aim has been to evoke National Geographic underwater video documentaries. Despite the lack of attribution for that quote, I think they really managed to nail that feeling, if that's what they were really going for. The game manages to really hit a lot of points I've mentioned previously. The slightly awkward control schemes remind you that you're controlling an entity in a completely different medium than you're used to traveling through. Although at least you're playing as something that's supposed to be moving through that medium in the first place. The in-game music in particular, composed by Tim Fallon, a legend in the video game community, is really good at capturing that National Geographic feeling. Gorgeous, but slightly eerie, with a potential to remind players that they are not in their element, they're in a hostile environment. The game certainly feels hostile at points as well. The first few levels pitting you against massive sharks and having you swim through stinging jellyfish while using your wits and maneuverability to defeat enemies. The subtle shifts in light shining on various surfaces under the water adds a lot to the game's aesthetic, as do the underwater environments themselves, incorporating corals, kelp, and fish to help flesh out spaces and keep the place feeling full of life. I've had the idea for this video in my head for more than a year now, and while I can't say for certain whether or not this game is what sparked that idea, it certainly illustrates exactly the points I've been trying to make throughout this video. I could keep going here. I haven't touched on surfing games or games like Wave Race 64 or Hydro Thunder, but I feel like I've made my point. Water works its way into nearly everything we do, in real life or, in many cases, video games. Its presence both provides context for and is given context by the visuals, sound, and themes of the games it's present in, to the point that if you remove the water from the game, it'd likely be unrecognizable, or at least a very different feeling game. It can bring peace or invoke primal fears, engage us to explore its depths, or be used as a barrier to push us away. Water is a very versatile substance, and I think that analyzing the ways it interacts with video games as a medium can be useful as a tool of introspection to help better understand what water means to us outside of a game and how we design games overall.